They were never supposed to be remembered, and yet their screams still echo beneath the soil of Ohio. In 1837, 32 children, entirely unrelated from different farms, different families, walked into the night and simply never came back. No bodies, no graves, not even footprints left behind. It was as if the earth itself swallowed them whole. And yet, history buried this story too. You weren't meant to know it, but tonight you will. Before we go further, do me one thing. Like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who thinks the past is safe. Because the past is not safe. It's alive. And I want to know, where are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments. Because as you listen to what I'm about to tell you, you'll realize these disappearances could have happened in your town. To your children. To you. Pause. Whisper lowers. They called it the Hollow Year. Farmers along the Ohio River began reporting the same nightmare. Children rising from their beds in the dead of night, walking outside silently, as though pulled by an unseen hand. Parents would awake to find blankets still warm, doors unlocked, and silence deeper than death filling the fields. At first, no one connected the events. A child missing here. Another 2 weeks later. Then 5 in a single night. The pattern spread like a plague no one could see. By autumn, 32 children were gone. Entire villages began to crumble. Fathers turning to alcohol, mothers driven to madness, preachers screaming that the devil himself had claimed the innocent. And then nothing. No evidence. No graves. No justice. Just silence. And a story that never made the newspapers beyond Ohio. It was erased, locked away in whispers. But I found something they tried to hide. A letter written by one of the last surviving parents. Her handwriting is shaking, broken, and every word burns with terror. She claimed the children were summoned by the bells. What bells? Where are they coming from? And who, or what, was calling these children into the night? This isn't folklore. This is a hole in history, and we're about to step inside it. The letter spoke of bells no one else could hear. At first, the mother thought her daughter was dreaming. The girl would rise in the middle of the night, eyes open yet empty, whispering, "They're calling me." The family lived miles from the nearest church. There were no bells. And yet, every night at the same hour, the child's body would pull itself toward the door as though enslaved by a rhythm only she could sense. The mother tried everything, locking the doors, tying her daughter's wrist to the bed, even placing a Bible under her pillow. But still, the girl strained against invisible chains, whispering in a tongue no one understood. And then one night, the bindings were empty. The bed was cold. The door was wide open. The mother swore she heard the bells herself that night. Not from a church, not from any tower, but from the ground beneath her feet. When the neighbors gathered, they confessed the same. Their children, too, had whispered about bells. Some said it was the sound of metal against stone, like chains rattling in the distance. Others claimed it was deeper, almost like a hum, alive, breathing, summoning. The pattern was undeniable. Every missing child was last seen during the night of full moon, always walking in the same direction, toward the woods bordering the Ohio River. But when search parties entered those woods, they found nothing. No footprints, no trails, no broken branches. As if the children had stepped into a world that overlapped our own, leaving no trace behind. One desperate father took to following the sound himself. They said he wandered the forest for days, his lantern burning low, chasing a bell no one else could hear. When he finally stumbled back into town, he was half mad, eyes wild, muttering one phrase over and over. "They're under us." The villagers pressed him. What did he mean? But his tongue collapsed into gibberish, as though some force had splintered his mind. He died 3 days later with soil under his nails, as if he had clawed at the earth until his last breath. The whispers grew louder after his death. Some claimed the ground itself was hollow, that beneath Ohio stretched not soil and stone, but chambers, ancient chambers. And the bells were not bells at all. Pause. Voice lowers. They were something much worse. When the word chambers spread through the villages, fear turned into obsession. Farmers began digging in their fields, convinced that if they struck deep enough, they would find the source of the sound. Some claimed to hear faint metallic echoes rising from the soil, like something ancient and restless stirring below. One man, a blacksmith, swore he had unearthed a slab of stone beneath his barn. Not natural rock, but cut smooth, deliberate. A surface too perfect to be formed by chance. He said it was carved with grooves, almost like an opening. He kept it secret at first, but his wife leaked the story. Within days, a crowd gathered, demanding to see. The blacksmith refused. He claimed that on the night he uncovered the slab, his youngest son woke screaming, thrashing in his bed, shouting a single word, "Below." The boy was dead by dawn. No wounds, no sickness, just gone. His heart had stopped. Terrified, the blacksmith sealed the site with earth. He told the villagers, "Whatever is beneath us, it doesn't want to be found." But the fear had already poisoned them. Rumors spread of underground halls built by something not human. Some whispered about the serpent builders, a forgotten race that existed before men claimed this land. Others believed it was a prison, and the bells were not a call, but a warning. The children kept vanishing, always toward the woods, always in silence, always under the moon. A preacher in a nearby town declared the disappearances a punishment from God. He spoke of sins buried in the soil, curses inherited from ancestors who had stolen sacred land. He urged families to repent, to burn their possessions, to purge themselves of corruption. For a time, his sermons gave people hope. But then his own daughter disappeared, and his voice was never heard again. The silence became unbearable. Families stopped speaking of the missing, as if words themselves gave power to the darkness. But in secret, mothers carved symbols above there. Children's doors, fathers sharpened iron stakes, and neighbors whispered of organizing a hunt. Not for wolves, not for men, but for the bells themselves. And that is when the first mass search began. Dozens of men armed with lanterns and rifles marched into the woods, swearing they would not return until the truth was uncovered. They never returned. Days later, only their lanterns were found, still burning. The discovery of the lanterns broke the last fragments of reason. They were found arranged in a circle deep within the woods, flames still flickering though their owners were gone. 30 lanterns, set like markers around a patch of ground where the soil was blackened, as if burned from within. No footprints, no blood, no rifles, only firelight and silence. The wives of the missing men swore they heard whispers drifting from the trees the night the search party vanished. Not screams, not human voices, but whispers, like children singing in low tones carried by the wind. One mother collapsed to her knees, swearing she recognized her son's voice among them. The town spiraled into panic. Crops went untended. Fields lay barren. Families boarded their windows and locked their doors, though locks seemed useless against something that could draw a child out of their bed without leaving a trace. But here is the detail that chilled me most when I uncovered it in forgotten records. The children weren't all vanishing from their own homes. Some were taken while sleeping in the houses of relatives or neighbors. The pull of the bells didn't care about walls, distance, or blood. It followed the child wherever they were, as though something had marked them. And then, an even darker pattern emerged. The dates of disappearance aligned with ancient feast days, nights once sacred to rituals far older than Ohio, far older than America itself. The nights when, according to European folklore, the boundary between the living and the buried dissolved. Had the settlers carried something across the ocean with them? A curse that took root in the Ohio soil? Or was it already here, waiting long before they arrived? One desperate farmer made a decision no one else dared. He nailed his barn shut and chained his son inside, believing that if he kept him trapped through the night of the full moon, the bells would pass him by. The neighbors heard the boy screaming against the boards, begging to be released, until the sound twisted into laughter that wasn't his own. At dawn, the father opened the barn. The chains were still locked, the boards unbroken, but the boy was gone, and in the dirt where he had been chained were 3 small bells. The 3 bells left behind in the barn were unlike anything the villagers had ever seen. Each was no larger than a child's hand, carved not of brass or bronze, but of some black, porous metal that seemed to drink in the light. When touched, they gave no sound, but held against the ear, one could feel, not hear, a vibration like a pulse. The farmer who found them hid the bells in a chest, terrified of what they meant. Yet word spread quickly, as it always does. Men whispered that these were the very instruments summoning their children. Women whispered that destroying them might break the curse. So they tried. The bells were hurled into fire, but they did not melt. They were smashed against stone, but they did not break. Finally, in desperation, one man struck a bell with his axe. The instant iron met the strange metal, the man fell backward, seizing violently on the ground. Foam poured from his mouth as his eyes rolled white. When he finally lay still, the only sound was the faint ringing of the bell, though no one had seen it move. The bells were buried deep in the riverbank that night, weighted with chains, prayed over by trembling preachers. But the next morning, they were found back in the barn, resting neatly in the same spot where the boy had vanished. That was when the elders of the town declared a new truth. The bells were not objects. They were messengers, and messages demand recipients. The missing children, they said, had not been stolen at random. They had been chosen, selected, summoned into the earth for a purpose that no mortal hand could interrupt. Panic shifted into dread, and dread hardened into resignation. Families stopped fighting, stopped searching. They sat by their windows at night, holding their children tightly, waiting to see whose time had come. Mothers wept silently in the dark, whispering bargains into the night air, begging unseen forces to take anyone else, but not their own. And yet, the bells did not bargain. They rang where they wished. They called who they desired. And once the call was answered, no prayer could silence it. Pause. Whisper low and sharp, because the bells were not summoning the children to death. They were summoning them to service. The word service spread through the villages like a toxin. Service to what? Service to whom? No priest, no scripture, no elder could answer. And yet the whispers grew, that the children had not perished, but had been taken below to labor in some hidden domain. One mother claimed she saw her daughter months after she vanished, not in flesh, but in a dream so vivid it gnawed at her sanity. The girl was pale, her eyes dull as candle wax, her hands bloodied from digging at black stone. She whispered, "We are building, we are building," and then her lips cracked into a smile that was not her own. The mother woke screaming, clawing her face until she bled. She swore the soil beneath her nails was the same black dust she saw in the dream. Soon, more parents confessed the same visions. Children in tunnels, children carrying stones, children chanting in unison, not in English, not in any tongue of man, but in a guttural, grinding sound like metal scraping bone. Always building, always digging, always serving. The bells, it seemed, were not the end. They were the call to work. One old trapper who had lived near the river longer than any settler whispered the most feared theory of all. The children were not building something new. They were repairing something old, something vast, something buried, something waiting. And if that were true, then every disappearance was not random tragedy, but deliberate construction, a design unfolding beneath Ohio, powered by the hands of the innocent. The trapper vanished days after speaking this aloud. His cabin was found empty, the hearth still warm. On his table lay a single sheet of parchment, on which he had scratched with shaking hand. They do not eat. They do not sleep. They only serve. The town began to fracture. Some fled, abandoning their farms, never to be seen again. Others clung to the land, believing that running would only anger whatever lived beneath. But a handful of men refused surrender. They swore if the children were trapped below, they would dig them out. They would descend into the hollow earth itself. They gathered shovels, picks, and ropes. They chose a night under the full moon. And as they began to dig near the woods where the lanterns were found, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The earth was not resisting them. It was opening. The men thought they were digging into solid ground. But as their shovels bit deeper, the soil gave way too easily, collapsing as if hollow beneath the surface. Within an hour, Their pit widened into a gaping maw, a wound in the earth that exhaled a breath both cold and damp. They lowered lanterns tied to ropes, and the light revealed walls not of raw soil, but of stone, cut, shaped, deliberate, a shaft descending straight into the belly of the land. The marks of chisels were visible, but no man alive had made them. The villagers above begged the men to stop. Some fell to their knees, praying, while others turned away, unable to watch. But the diggers refused. They had sworn oaths to their children, and the fear of the unknown was weaker than the ache of empty beds. One by one, they descended into the shaft. The air grew heavy, thick with a metallic taste that clung to their tongues. The deeper they went, the louder the faint vibration became, like 1,000 invisible bells humming in unison. At the bottom, their lanterns revealed a corridor. The stone walls curved unnaturally, sloping in ways that seemed to bend perspective itself. Symbols were etched into the stone, spirals, serpents, and eyes that seemed to follow them no matter where they turned. And there, in the silence, they found the first sign of life. A toy doll, handmade, resting carefully against the wall, its face half-rotted, one button eye missing. The men froze. One whispered, "This was my daughter's." Further down, they found more. A wooden horse, a small shoe, a braid of ribbon, tokens of children who had vanished, placed neatly, almost ceremonially, as though marking a path. But the path led deeper, and the sound of the bells grew louder with every step. It was no longer faint. It was inside them, rattling their bones, syncing with their heartbeats until they could not tell whether it was sound or thought. Then, from the darkness ahead, they heard it. Not bells, not whispers, children's voices, singing. The men raised their lanterns, their breath shallow. And just beyond the reach of light, small figures stood in rows, facing the wall, motionless. When a nearest lantern flickered, one of the children turned its head, slowly, impossibly, its eyes reflecting light like polished stone. And then all 32 turned at once. The lantern light trembled in their hands as the children faced them. 32 of them, pale and still, lined along the walls like statues. Their eyes did not blink. Their lips did not move. And yet, the sound of singing poured from the cavern, layered and endless, as though hundreds of voices bled through them. One of the men stepped forward, choking back his terror. He called out his son's name. The boy's head tilted slightly, as if recognizing the word, but his face held no memory, no spark. Only a glassy reflection, like a doll painted to resemble a child. Then the singing stopped. The silence was worse than the song. The children raised their hands in unison. Their fingers were cracked, caked with black soil, nails split from endless labor. They pointed, not at the men, not at the shaft above, but deeper into the corridor, toward the darkness where no light reached. The men hesitated, torn between fear and desperation. That hesitation was enough. The children began to move, not with stumbling steps, but with a perfect, synchronized motion, as though they shared a single will. Their feet never faltered. Their eyes never shifted. One man dropped his lantern, panic overtaking him. The flame hissed out as it struck the damp stone floor, plunging half the chamber into shadow. The singing returned instantly, this time louder, harsher, no longer melodic but commanding. It wasn't the children who sang. It was something through them. Another man shouted prayers, clutching a crucifix, his voice breaking. The sound seemed to anger the unseen presence. The walls trembled, dust falling from the ceiling like ash. The children screamed, not in pain, not in fear, but in a single, unified wail that bent the air itself. The men stumbled backward, weapons useless against what stood before them. Still, one of them, a father whose eyes were raw from sleepless nights, dropped his rifle and fell to his knees. He begged his daughter to come back, to remember his face, his voice, their home. For the briefest moment, her lips trembled. The chant faltered. The other children paused, heads twitching as if confused. Hope sparked, but then the girl opened her mouth, and the sound that poured out was not her own. It was the toll of a bell. The bell's toll shuddered through the cavern, low and resonant, though no bell could be seen. The men clutched their ears, but the sound was not in the air. It was inside their skulls, vibrating through their teeth, rattling their bones. Some dropped to the ground, writhing, blood trickling from their noses. The girl's mouth remained open, stretched far wider than humanly possible. From her throat poured a darkness that was not shadow but smoke, thick, black, and alive. It curled along the ceiling like a serpent, twisting, splitting, gathering form. The other children mirrored her, their jaws unhinging, their throats releasing the same black smoke until the entire chamber swam with it. The lanterns flickered violently, their flames shrinking as if starved of air. And in the center of that smoke, something stirred. The men backed toward the shaft, but the walls seemed to warp, lengthening, bending, making the exit impossibly far. Their lantern light no longer reached the stone they swore had been just behind them. A voice rose from the smoke, not a voice of man or woman, but of depth itself, like an abyss speaking. It echoed inside their skulls, searing thought, burning reason. The work is not yet finished. The hands must serve. The earth must open. One of the men screamed, swinging his rifle wildly, firing into the smoke. The gunshot cracked, the recoil throwing him back, but the bullet vanished into nothing. The echo of the shot was swallowed whole, as though sound itself obeyed the thing. The children began to walk forward. Their movements were rigid, mechanical, yet their eyes glowed faintly now, no longer dull stone, but embers, pulsing with each toll of the unseen bell. The father who had begged for his daughter moments earlier could not move. He reached out, trembling, tears burning his face. "Please," he whispered, "I'll take your place. Take me instead." For the first time, the smoke shifted as if listening. The toll of the bell slowed, deepened. The children stopped mid-step. The father gasped, hope rising in his chest. And then 32 heads turned toward him at once. 32 mouths opened, and 32 voices, his daughters among them, spoke in unison. "You already serve." The words, "you already serve," echoed through the cavern like a verdict. The father staggered back, his body convulsing as if invisible strings had been pulled tight around his spine. His eyes rolled upward, his mouth locked open in a silent scream. Then his hands, those same calloused hands that once built barns and plowed fields, turned against him, clawing at his own chest as though something inside wanted out. The other men tried to grab him, but the moment they touched his skin, they felt it too, a current, electric and alien, coursing from him into them. It wasn't heat. It wasn't cold. It was possession. Their lanterns guttered low, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. Within those shadows, faint shapes began to crawl. Spindly limbs, serpentine coils, heads that were not quite human, but wore the mockery of human faces. They slithered across the stone like reflections without bodies. The black smoke thickened, congealing into veins that ran across the walls, glowing faintly red like embers buried deep in coal. It looked less like a cavern and more like the inside of something alive. And all the while, the children stood in perfect stillness, their eyes locked on the men, their chests rising and falling in unison as though they shared a single breath. Then came the sound. Not bells this time, not voices, drums. A slow, pounding rhythm, each strike reverberating through the stone, through the air, through their blood. The men clutched their chests, their heartbeats sinking with the rhythm until they could no longer tell if their hearts belonged to them. One of the diggers dropped his lantern, falling to his knees. He began to chant, words not his own, syllables older than the soil, scraping from his throat as though he had always known them. The others watched in horror as his eyes blackened, his veins darkened, and his body bowed toward the smoke as if in worship. The drums grew louder, closer, shaking the very walls. Dust fell in sheets, the floor cracking beneath their boots. Something immense was stirring below. The father, still frozen, still writhing, let out one last ragged cry. His voice was his own again, just for a moment. "It's waking." Those words did not fall into silence. They were swallowed. The drums quickened. The walls of the cavern groaned, and the children dropped to their knees in perfect unison, their foreheads pressed to the stone as though bowing before something immense and unseen. The men stumbled back, but the air itself pressed against them, thick and heavy, forcing their lungs to labor for every breath. Then the smoke parted, and they saw it. Not fully. Not yet. Only fragments of a shape buried beneath the stone. A colossal form, coiled like a serpent, its surface layered in scales the color of burnt obsidian. Each scale pulsed faintly, as though lit from within by fire. And between those scales, veins of red light ran upward through the rock, feeding into the children as though their bodies were lanterns. One man whispered, "It's alive," and the words alone seemed to draw its attention. The drums ceased. The cavern stilled. Then came a sound, deeper than any bell, louder than any drum. A heartbeat. A rhythm so vast it shook dust from the ceiling and cracked the ground beneath their feet. The children lifted their heads. Their mouths opened, and in that perfect unity they spoke, not as 32 voices but as one, amplified, resonant, inhuman. The womb is not sealed. The gates must be built. We serve until the earth opens. The men could not move. Their legs trembled as though the very command had seized their muscles. The words branded themselves into their minds, hot and undeniable. Even those who did not understand their meaning felt the truth. Whatever slept here was not meant to remain buried. One of the diggers, face streaked with sweat and ash, broke. He ran, screaming, stumbling back toward the shaft. The others called after him, but his lantern light faded into the distance. Seconds later, his scream cut short, not by struggle, not by violence, but by silence, as if he had been erased. The smoke thickened, curling into tendrils that reached upward along the shaft, clawing toward the surface. The men realized with dawning horror that it wasn't just their children who had been taken into service. The earth itself was bending, reshaping, enslaved to a far older than mankind. And from the depths of that slumbering form came a second heartbeat. Louder, closer, awakening. 2 heartbeats. The sound rolled through the stone like thunder, trapped beneath the earth, rattling the lanterns until their flames bent sideways. The men pressed themselves against the walls, clutching their heads as the rhythm hammered through their skulls. One whispered, trembling, "It's not 1, it's 2. The children's voices rose again, chanting in that alien tongue. Each syllable carried weight, vibrating the bones of the men who heard it. But one among them, a schoolteacher who had studied scraps of Latin and Greek, swore he recognized fragments hidden inside the chant. Words that shouldn't belong together. Words that had traveled through time like parasites. He gasped when the meaning took shape. "They're not gods. They are wombs." The others stared at him, uncomprehending, but the truth sank in his eyes like poison. The children were not serving a sleeping beast. They were midwives to something far worse. These chambers were not tombs. They were incubators. And Ohio was not cursed ground by chance. It was chosen. Generations before, long before settlers came, the land had been sacred to tribes who avoided it entirely. Old stories spoke of the serpents below, beings who slumbered until the earth was ready to crack. Ritual dances, bonfires, offerings, these were not worship but containment, a system of guardianship to hold back what writhed beneath. But when those guardians were slaughtered or driven out, the rituals ended, and the soil, freed from its bindings, began to whisper again. It called to the weakest, the youngest, the most innocent. Children were the perfect vessels because they could be remade, reshaped, hollowed out without resistance. The men realized with dawning horror. Their sons and daughters had not simply vanished. They had been rebuilt, flesh and bone emptied of will, filled with purpose. Tools in the construction of gates through which these ancient wombs would one day emerge. The teacher fell to his knees, muttering that the earth was ripening, that every disappearance was part of a cycle, and that the second heartbeat meant the cycle was nearly complete. Then, as if to confirm his words, the cavern shuddered violently. Cracks split the floor, widening into black fissures. From them oozed a thick, tar-like substance that hissed when it touched the stone. The children bowed again, hands pressed flat to the ground, their chanting louder now, more frenzied. The men looked at one another, faces pale, eyes wide. And one said the only truth left to say. We're standing inside a womb. The word womb lingered in the cavern like a curse. As if answering, the fissures in the ground split wider, belching waves of heat and the stench of rot, a smell so thick it clawed the back of their throats. The tar that oozed upward bubbled as though alive, writhing in patterns too deliberate to be chance. The children's chanting intensified, their voices climbing to a pitch that seemed to scrape the marrow from bone. They pressed their foreheads harder into the stone, fingers digging until nails tore free, blood dripping into the fissures as if feeding them. Then movement. From the largest crack, something began to rise. Not a hand, not a head, something else. A column of flesh, wet, glistening, pulsing. It coiled upward like an umbilical cord the size of a tree trunk, veins glowing faintly red beneath its translucent surface. The thing twitched and convulsed as though straining against the earth that still bound it. The men stumbled back, some gagging, others clutching their rifles with shaking hands. One fired into the mass. The bullet tore through, releasing a spray of steaming black fluid that hissed when it struck the stone. The cord recoiled, then stilled, and the children screamed, not in fear, in anger. Their voices rose so loud the stone trembled. The one who had fired collapsed, his body racked by convulsions, his chest splitting open in 3 jagged tears, as if invisible claws had raked him from within. He gasped once, then lay still. The cord twitched again. This time it grew higher, thicker, sprouting tendrils that groped blindly through the air, seeking. They wrapped around the corpse, lifted it, and dragged it into the fissure. The body vanished in an instant, swallowed whole. The teacher whispered through clenched teeth, "It's feeding. It needs him alive or dead. It doesn't matter." His eyes were wide with terror. Every child, every man, it's nourishment. It's growing. The others shouted for him to stop, to be silent, but it was too late. The children rose to their feet again, their heads snapping toward him with unnatural speed. 32 mouths opened at once, and in perfect unison, they hissed. "You understand?" The teacher froze. His lantern shook in his trembling hand, shadows skittering across the pulsating cord. For the first time, he realized understanding was not a gift. It was an invitation. The words, "You understand," cut deeper than any blade. The teacher's knees buckled. His lantern clattered to the stone, the flame nearly dying before flaring weakly back to life. He stared at the children, their eyes glowing with that ember light, their mouths hanging open as if they waited for him to answer. He shook his head violently. "No, I don't want this." His voice cracked, but the truth was already burning in his mind, written there by something vast and merciless. He did understand. He had seen it in the fissures, felt it in the chant. This was not a birth that could be stopped. It was a birth that demanded witnesses, caretakers, servants. The other men grabbed his arms, trying to drag him back toward the shaft, but his body resisted them. His feet scraped against the stone as if rooted, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the pulsating cord. "I can't," he whispered. "It wants me." The fissures widened, and more cords began to rise, smaller, thinner, like veins reaching for blood. They slithered across the floor, writhing toward the teacher. He screamed, thrashing, but the others held on, pulling with all their strength. For a moment, it seemed they might succeed, dragging him away from the encroaching tendrils. Then the children screamed again. The cords lunged, faster than any snake. They wrapped his legs, his waist, his arms, yanking him from the men's grasp. His nails tore as he clawed at the stone, shrieking. The cords lifted him into the air, suspending him above the fissure, his lantern light flickering wildly against the cavern walls. His eyes rolled down to the others, filled not with pleading, but with horror, horror that he had seen too much. "Don't fight it," he bellowed. His voice cracked into madness. "If you resist, it takes. But if you serve, it spares you." The others shouted, reaching upward, but the cords dragged him down, pulling him into the fissure. His scream echoed until it was cut short, swallowed in the wet darkness. The cavern fell silent except for the sound of the cords pulsing, retreating back into the earth, thicker now, stronger. The children lowered their heads again. Their chanting resumed, louder than before. And then the men heard it, the faintest sound from above. The church bells of the village, ringing, at midnight, when no one had touched the ropes. The tolling of the bells froze the men in place. Their echo carried down a shaft like a summons, each strike deliberate, mechanical, hollow. No hands could be pulling the ropes, because every villager was either asleep in their beds or missing entirely. The men clambered back toward the ladder, fear gnawing through their resolve. They no longer cared about saving children or uncovering truth. Survival had become the only instinct left. Boots scraped against stone as they scrambled upward, the lantern light bouncing wildly, throwing the cavern into jagged shadows. But even as they climbed, the chanting of the children continued below, rising, filling the cavern with vibrations that shook dust from the ceiling. And beneath that chant, something else stirred. The tolling of the bells joined in rhythm with the voices, as though the entire village itself had become an instrument of the ritual. When they finally burst into the night air, gasping for breath, the scene awaiting them was worse than anything below. The village square glowed faintly, not with lanterns, but with a red phosphorescence seeping from the soil itself. The church loomed in the center, its windows pulsing with light, its steeple trembling with every toll. And the villagers, those who should have been sleeping, were standing in perfect rows along the street. Silent, motionless, eyes closed. The men staggered forward, whispering their names, shaking their shoulders. No response. Their bodies were warm, their chests rose and fell with shallow breaths. But their faces were slack, their lips muttering fragments of the same chant echoing below. They were alive, but absent. One man broke, shouting in panic, sprinting toward his home. His wife stood at the doorway, swaying gently, her hands outstretched as if waiting for him. He grabbed her shoulders, begging her to wake. But when her eyes opened, there was nothing inside them, only the ember glow, the same fire that burned in the children. Her mouth moved, and a voice that was not her own hissed into his ear. "The womb is opening." He stumbled back, horrified, as she collapsed to her knees, body convulsing. The soil beneath her cracked, splitting open to reveal the same black ooze bubbling upward. It spread across the ground like veins of liquid night, connecting doorways, wells, and streets, weaving the entire village into one vast, living network. The men realized with dawning horror, the village itself was becoming an extension of the womb. And the bells tolled again, shaking the stars. The bells struck again, rattling every window pane in the village, each note sinking into the bones of the men like a curse. The ground beneath their boots trembled, alive with that black, bubbling ooze that coursed like veins across the cobblestones. Wherever it touched, the earth pulsed faintly, as though drawing breath. The silent villagers swayed in unison, their bodies bending to some rhythm no ear should have heard. The men stumbled backward, terrified to step on the dark veins writhing at their feet, yet surrounded by them at every turn. One whispered, his voice cracking, "We can't stay here. We'll be swallowed." But another shook his head violently, pointing to the church. "It's coming from there, the light, the bells, the rot. If we leave it, it'll spread beyond the village, to the next town, to the world." His voice broke into sobs. Someone has to end it. Their eyes rose together to the steeple. The windows glowed brighter now, pulsing in time with the chant from below. Inside, shadows writhed against the glass, shapes too large, too twisted to be human. Something was forming within the church, something being nourished by every villager's vacant body, every drop of ooze that now threaded through the streets. The men argued in whispers, desperation clashing with terror. Run or burn it all. And then, without warning, the villagers' heads snapped upward in unison. Their eyes opened. Ember light spilled across the night. Dozens of faces turning in perfect synchronicity toward the survivors. One man cried out, dropping his rifle, backing away. "They see us, God, they see us." The rows of villagers began to move, slow at first, then faster, their arms outstretched, their chants rising from whispers to screams. The air grew heavy with sulfur and iron, choking every breath. The men fired into the crowd, bullets tearing into bodies that fell only to rise again, their wounds spilling black ichor instead of blood. The glow in their eyes never dimmed. The teacher's voice echoed in their memory. If you resist, it takes. If you serve, it spares. But none of them wanted to serve. So they gathered what oil and pitch they could find from abandoned carts, dragging it toward the church doors, the mob closing in behind them. Their only thought was fire. Fire before the womb finished opening. Yet as they splashed the doors, the bells fell silent. And a voice spoke, low, resonant, and human. "Burn it, and you burn yourselves." The silence after the voice was worse than the bells. The men froze, oil dripping from their trembling hands, their torches guttering in the night wind. The church stood before them like a living beast, its timbers groaning, its stained glass quivering as if lungs pressed against the inside. One man dared whisper, "Did you hear it?" But the others didn't answer because there was no need. The words had not entered through their ears. They had arrived inside their skulls, branded into thought itself. The church doors swelled outward, would bending unnaturally as if the building inhaled. Then the doors cracked open, not by hinges but by splitting flesh. From the lantern light, they could see the grain of the wood ripple, pulsing with veins that oozed black resin. The sacred house of God had become a membrane, half structure, half organism. From within came a heat, a furnace of decay, carrying the stench of rot and sulfur. The men staggered back, covering their mouths, but the voice thundered again, vibrating their teeth. "You cannot stop the womb. You are already written into its flesh." The villagers advanced, their ember-lit eyes reflecting the glow from the church. Their feet dragged, but with terrible purpose, forming a circle around the survivors. There was no escape now. One man, his face streaked with ash and tears, screamed and hurled his torch at the open doors. The flames caught for a moment, licking across the membrane like wood, but instead of burning, the fire was sucked inward, devoured. The torch vanished in a hiss, leaving behind a charred hole that pulsed like a cauterized wound. The church moaned. The sound was neither human nor architectural. It was the moan of a mother in labor, deep, primal, echoing through the square. Windows shattered from the vibration, spraying shards across the street. The villagers fell to their knees, as if in reverence, their arms raised, their chanting reaching an unbearable pitch. The men clutched their ears, blood dripping between their fingers. One dropped to the ground, convulsing, his eyes rolling back as his lips muttered words not his own. His skin stretched tight against his bones, veins bulging black beneath. The others tried to drag him back, but his body stiffened, his jaw unhinged. And from his throat, not his mouth, but deep within, came a wet, crawling hiss. It is crowning. The church walls split down the middle. Something enormous was pressing outward. The walls groaned like bones, snapping under weight. Every beam of the church bending outward until the steeple shook loose tiles that shattered on the cobblestones below. The great doors yawned wider, not swinging, but tearing, fibers ripping, veins splitting, until the opening resembled a wound more than an entrance. A heat wave blasted through the square, stinking of copper, char, and wet soil. The villagers wailed in unison, their bodies jerking as though tethered by unseen strings. The glow in their eyes flared, syncing perfectly with the pulse of light from within the church. And then it pushed through. First came the sound, a scraping, wet and fibrous like muscle dragging against stone. Then the shape, a massive, glistening crown of flesh, slick with black ichor, pressed against the opening, distorting the church walls further. The stained glass windows didn't shatter. They dissolved, colors melting like wax, flowing down the walls as if unwilling to bear witness. The men stumbled backward, choking on terror. One screamed, "It's birthing!" His voice cracked into hysteria, swallowed by the villagers' chants. A head forced its way into the night. Not a human head, not even animal. It was a mass of eyes, opening one by one, blinking with sickly light, each iris a tiny ember, burning with intelligence older than language. The eyes turned in every direction at once, surveying the square, locking on the survivors. The voice returned, deeper now, resonant enough to rattle the marrow in their bones. Your world is thin. We press and it tears. You cannot close what is born. The body followed. Enormous, sinewed arms clawed outward, each finger jointed like broken branches, nails stretching into hooked talons that pierced stone. Where they struck, the cobblestones softened like flesh. One of the men broke, sprinting for the edge of the village, but the veins of black ooze rose up to meet him, coiling around his legs like serpents. They dragged him screaming into the soil, his voice cutting off as the earth swallowed him whole. The others could do nothing but watch. The creature pulled more of itself free, its vast chest splitting into slits that opened and closed like breathing mouths. From within, smaller shapes writhed, clawing toward the opening. Not children anymore. Things wearing the shapes of children, their eyes burning red, their mouths whispering in unison. The men finally understood. The missing 32 were not gone. They had become this. And the birth was not yet finished. The square convulsed under the pressure of what was emerging, the ground cracking like dry skin. The church was no longer a building, but a wound in reality, splitting wider with each contraction. The villagers remained on their knees, their chants rising, their arms lifted in trembling devotion. They were not afraid, they were midwives. The remaining men pressed together, their torches trembling in weak fists. Every instinct screamed to flee, but they knew the truth now. There was nowhere left to run. If this thing emerged fully, it would not remain confined to their cursed village. It would spread like infection, swallowing everything. One of them, his face streaked with soot and tears, spoke through gritted teeth. "We can't stop it from coming, but we can stop it from staying." The others stared, hollow-eyed, until he pulled from his coat a small leather pouch. Inside rattled black powder, gunpowder, stolen from a quarry. Not nearly enough to kill such a creature, but enough to collapse the church upon itself. Enough to bury the womb. Hope was gone, but purpose flickered. Their breath steadied. If they were to die, they would die sealing this nightmare. They rushed toward the church, pushing through the heat and stench. The thing's enormous head turned, its 100 eyes narrowing in unison. Its taloned arms scraped the ground, clawing toward them, but the creature was still trapped in the half-birth, bound by its own writhing flesh. The men lit their torches anew, thrusting them into the pouches of powder and oil scattered around the square. Flames bloomed, feeding on wood, rope, and resin. One of them screamed at the villagers, "If you worship this, then burn with it." The faithful didn't resist. They only laughed, their ember-glowing eyes fixed on the rising titan. To them, the men were not enemies, but sacrifices written into the story of birth. The detonations began to chain together, small eruptions tearing beams from the church's frame, sending shrapnel of glowing glass into the night sky. The church itself roared, as though the structure had lungs. The men hurled themselves into the chaos, dragging barrels toward the fissure, tipping them over, oil soaking into the pulsing earth. The creature thrashed, its talons tearing gouges into the square. Its voices layered into one thunderous cry. You cannot bury hunger. It will always dig itself free. Still, the men lit the final fuse. The church began to collapse, and in the moment before the world turned fire, they heard the children's voices laughing. The fuse hissed, then vanished into blinding silence. For a breath, there was nothing, no chants, no drums, no screaming wind. The square hung still, every sound swallowed like the air had been ripped away. Even the creature's 100 eyes froze, unblinking, waiting. Then came the rupture. A roar split the night, louder than thunder, louder than war. Fire tore through the square in a chain of blooming suns, each explosion consuming stone, flesh, and bone alike. The church collapsed inward, its steeple folding like paper, its walls imploding as though crushed by an invisible fist. The villagers were erased in the blast, their glowing eyes shattering into sparks that rained down before dissolving into ash. Their chants ended not in screams, but in a single note of release, as if they had fulfilled their purpose. The creature bellowed, 1,000 voices layered into one. Its head slammed against the collapsing walls, its talons raked through stone, its body writhing in a storm of fire and smoke. And yet, its laughter remained, not joyous, not mocking, but inevitable. The men were thrown like rag dolls, their bodies hurled against the stones. Ears bleeding, lungs burning, they dragged themselves to their knees to see if their sacrifice had worked. For a moment, it seemed so. The church was gone. The square was a pit of rubble and flame. The air burned black, stinking of charred flesh and melted iron. The beast's form was buried beneath collapsing stone and earth, its limbs twitching as if struggling against the weight. Its eyes, hundreds of them, flickered, dimming one by one, like candles guttering out. One of the men, his arm broken, whispered hoarsely, "We did it. By God, we did it." But then the earth moved, not in tremors, not in cracks, but in breathing. The rubble rose and fell in waves, as though the soil itself had lungs. From the fissures between the stones, black smoke poured, not dispersing into the sky, but sinking low, curling around the survivors, weaving into their nostrils and mouths. And then they heard it, not the roar of a beast, not the wail of children, but whispers, endless, layered whispers, speaking from beneath the rubble, from beneath the earth itself. You did not stop the birth. You only tore the womb. Now we are everywhere. The survivors clutched their ears, but the sound was inside them now, seated in a thought, impossible to silence. And from beneath the ruin, something vast shifted again. The birth was not ended. It had only changed form. The men staggered through the smoke, their bodies broken but alive. They thought survival meant victory. But as they crawled into the open fields beyond the square, they realized the battlefield had followed them. The earth itself was whispering. Every blade of grass trembled, not in wind but in rhythm, as though the soil pulsed with a hidden heartbeat. The whispers threaded through the stalks of corn, curling around the trees, echoing beneath the ground. It wasn't language anymore. It was suggestion, a pulling at the edges of thought. One of the men stopped, his face blank, his wounds forgotten. Slowly, mechanically, he bent down, scooped a handful of dirt, and shoved it into his mouth. The others screamed, tried to wrestle it away, but he bit and swallowed, his teeth breaking on pebbles, his lips bleeding against roots. And when they dragged him down, he looked at them with soil dripping from his tongue and whispered, "It tastes like home." Panic broke them. They scattered across the fields, but the land itself betrayed them. Roots curled around their boots. The furrows of plowed earth seemed to deepen into trenches, pulling them down, sucking their feet like quicksand. And the smoke followed, slithering low, never rising to the stars. It crept into their mouths, their nostrils, their open wounds. They coughed, they gagged, they screamed until their voices became indistinguishable from the whispers themselves. But worse still, the children's laughter returned. It came from the tree lines, from hollow barns, from beneath the fields. The same missing voices they had once searched for now guided the smoke, mocking, playful, circling them in cruel delight. One man fell to his knees, sobbing, shouting his daughter's name. And for a fleeting moment, he swore he saw her standing in the corn rows, barefoot, smiling. He ran to her, arms wide, and vanished into the earth. The survivors dwindled, one by one, consumed by soil or smoke or the cruel mirage of their children's faces. Their sacrifices had not saved them. Their resistance had not delayed the inevitable, because the fire had not destroyed the beast. It had released its essence, scattering it through the land. Now, the soil itself was alive, drinking every memory, every voice, every breath. And as dawn broke over Ohio, nothing stirred in the village but the echo of bells softly ringing beneath the ground. When the sun rose over Ohio, its light was pale and distorted, as though filtered through smoke that wasn't there. The fields glistened with dew, but the droplets shimmered black, reflecting not the sky, but eyes. Dozens, hundreds, each drop a window into something watching back. Travelers on horseback, unaware of the night's terror, approached the village. They found no screams, no smoke, no bodies. Only silence. The square was rubble, the church reduced to a broken husk of stone. And yet, the riders swore they heard bells ringing faintly, far below the earth. One dismounted, walked across the blackened stones, and froze. The soil pulsed beneath his boots, breathing. A whisper slithered into his ears, soft, familiar, intimate. It spoke not in riddles, but in memory, the voice of his dead mother, calling his name. He collapsed to his knees, clawing at the ground, begging her to rise. The others dragged him back, but his eyes had already gone black, veins twisting like roots beneath his skin. He screamed, not in pain but in laughter, a child's laughter. The riders fled. But when they reached the next town, 20 miles east, the infection had already arrived. The wells bubbled black. The livestock stood motionless in their pens, eyes glazed, as if listening to something no one else could hear. And the children, those who had been playing in the streets at dawn, were suddenly gone, leaving only their shoes behind in neat rows, pointing west toward the ruined village. Panic spread like fire. Families locked their doors, priests lit candles through the night, and farmers whispered prayers over their fields. But no prayer could silence the murmurs beneath the soil. At night, people woke to find dirt beneath their fingernails, though they had not left their beds. Some were found at dawn, buried to the waist in their own fields, smiling as though in sleep. And then came the birds. Black flocks, 1,000 strong, swirled over the countryside, blotting out the sun. Their cries were not the cries of animals, but voices, hundreds of voices, layered, chanting. Every town they passed through heard their message. The children are not gone. The children are seeds. By the third day, Ohio itself was rotting. Rivers ran dark. The soil refused to yield crops. And every wind carried whispers that no man could silence. It was no longer a single cursed town. It was a spreading hunger. The hunger did not spread randomly. It moved with purpose. By the seventh day, 3 towns had fallen. Not with fire, not with war, but with silence. Travelers found streets where doors hung open, meals rotted half-eaten on tables, and toys lay abandoned in the dirt. No bodies, no footprints leaving town, just absence. Yet when night fell, the wind carried songs. Children's lullabies drifting from empty houses, harmonizing perfectly as if hundreds of voices rehearsed a chorus beneath the earth. Farmers who lingered at the edges of the infected towns reported patterns forming in their fields overnight. Corn stalks bent into spirals, wheat pressed into labyrinths, symbols vast enough to be seen only from the sky. At first, they thought it was vandalism. But the precision, the alignment with the stars above, spoke of something impossibly deliberate. One symbol appeared again and again. 2 interlocking circles, one whole, one broken. Priests swore it was blasphemy. Scholars claimed it was an ancient sigil for birth. The farmers called it simply the mark of the soil. And those who stood too long inside the patterns never returned the same. They spoke differently. Their words carried rhythm. Their eyes glowed faintly in firelight, as though lit from within by embers. They no longer called themselves by their given names, but whispered instead, "We are the roots." Worse still, animals began to obey them. Herds of cattle moved in perfect formation, circling barns. Dogs sat in silence, staring west, refusing food, refusing touch. Even the insects swarmed in strange geometries, forming shapes in the air that mirrored the sigils burned into the land. The whispers were no longer just haunting. They were building, calculating. A schoolteacher who kept a journal in a nearby town recorded the progression. Day 1, the children are gone. Day 2, the ground hums at night. Day 4, the voices chant in numbers. Sevens, always sevens. Day 6, the wells boil when the moon is full. Day 7, it is not chaos. It is order. Her final entry was written not in ink, but in mud. The words still legible today. The womb is opening. By then, Ohio was no longer a land of farms and villages. It was a gestation chamber, its soil twisting, its people consumed, its sky darkened by symbols only the initiated could understand. And at the center of it all, the children's laughter never ceased. It only grew louder. By the 10th day, the whispers had changed. They no longer drifted aimlessly through the night like forgotten hymns. They sharpened, became commands. Those who had once stumbled through their homes in confusion now moved with purpose. They rose at midnight, eyes black and unblinking, and walked in lines across the countryside. Farmers abandoned plows in their fields. Mothers left infants crying in cradles. Entire congregations left their churches mid-sermon, filing silently into the darkness as though summoned by a bell only they could hear. Witnesses who hid and watched swore the voices spoke in unison. To the root, to the root, to the root. The root was not metaphor. It was a place. In the heart of the forest, where the vanished village once stood, the ground had ruptured. Trees leaned inward, their branches contorted like skeletal arms pointing down. The soil had split into a vast circle of blackened earth, charred as if struck by lightning, though no storm had passed. From that fissure came the sound, low, steady, like the beating of a colossal heart. Those who followed the whispers gathered at its edge. Hundreds stood in silence, staring down into the chasm. Some wept softly, but none turned away. Children stood at the front, hands clasped, faces serene, as though waiting for a teacher to speak. And then it began. The ground trembled, and the fissure deepened. Roots, thick, pulsing, wet with soil and blood, rose from the depths. They writhed like serpents, weaving together into structures, towers of flesh and bark, arches that groaned as they grew. The forest itself was being rewritten, reshaped into a cathedral not built by human hands, but by something older. The congregation dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads into the mud. They chanted, not in words, but in vibrations, the same thrumming rhythm that had haunted the bells. The sound merged with the pulse from below until it seemed the land itself was chanting. And then the children stepped forward. One by one, they walked into the fissure, disappearing into the dark, swallowed whole by the earth. Not screaming, not resisting, smiling. The adults did not move to stop them. They only whispered over and over. The root is hungry. The root is holy. What the earth was birthing, none could yet see. But all of Ohio had become its womb. The fissure widened. What had once been a gash in the soil now yawned like the mouth of a beast. An endless pit ringed with roots slick with sap and blood. The sound was deafening. A heartbeat that was not theirs, a rhythm that threatened to rupture skulls. And still, no one fled. From the depths, a glow rose. Not fire, not light, but something like molten marrow, thick, golden, veined with black. It pulsed up through the roots, running like rivers beneath their barked skin. The forest glistened, alive in a way no forest should ever be. Then it began to shape itself. The roots twined upward, fusing into colossal limbs that bent and cracked until they resembled something almost humanoid. A torso of bark and sinew. Arms too long, fingers like sharpened branches tipped with bone. A head formed last, elongated, crowned not with hair, but with writhing vines, each tipped with a child's skull. It stood, but not entirely. Its body remained tethered to the earth by a vast trunk, as if it were both tree and beast, both womb and executioner. Its hollow eyes burned with that molten glow, scanning the congregation. And then came the voice. Not whispered, Not distant, direct, piercing. You called us gods. You forgot we were roots. The ground shook with each syllable. The people trembled, but not with fear. They raised their arms, as though welcoming a king. The children's laughter, so faint for weeks, now rang like bells overhead. But the sound was wrong. It didn't echo in the air. It came from beneath the skin of the adults, as if the children's voices had rooted inside them, using their flesh as resonators. The thing looked down upon them, vines twitching, skulls chattering, and spoke again. Flesh is seed. Memory is soil. We are the harvest. At that command, the congregation began tearing at themselves. Fingers dug into their own flesh, peeling skin as if unwrapping offerings. Blood slicked the roots, feeding them, thickening them. The earth drank greedily. And still, no screams, only devotion. The pit glowed brighter. The rhythm thundered louder. What rose from Ohio that night was not simply a beast, nor a god. It was a reclamation, and the world above had no name for it. The first to be taken were the farmers. Men who once worked the soil now sank into it, their bodies swallowed waist-deep before they could even gasp. The roots coiled around their legs, spiraling upward with sickening speed, binding them like prey wrapped by a serpent. Yet there was no struggle, only submission. Their arms lifted skyward as their mouths opened wide, not in pain, but in reverence. The ground did not merely consume them. It rewrote them. Their bones cracked and extended, ribs fusing with bark, veins hardening into sap, flesh dissolving into loam. Soon, rows of human-shaped trees stood where men had knelt, faces still visible beneath the bark, eyes blinking faintly, mouths whispering prayers though no lungs remained. The women followed, stepping forward willingly, skirts dragging in the mud. They collapsed upon the roots, as though falling into the embrace of a lover. The vines slid beneath their skin, bulging and pulsing as if veins were being replaced with something alien. Their bellies swelled grotesquely in seconds, and then split, not with blood, but with blossoms. White flowers bloomed where wombs had once been, releasing a fragrance so sweet it burned the throat. Each blossom dripped golden sap, collected greedily by the vines below. The children, already smiling, reached out to touch those blossoms. The moment their fingers brushed the petals, their bodies dissolved into light, absorbed straight into the root. Their laughter echoed, not in the forest, but inside the skulls of every witness, a chorus that made thought itself impossible. And it spread. The harvest was not contained to the clearing. Roots burst through fields miles away, breaking fences, splitting roads, coiling up church steeples. Towns awoke to the sound of cracking wood and tearing stone as the earth beneath their feet pulsed with life, not their own. Homes collapsed into sinkholes of writhing bark. Entire families pulled underground before a single cry reached the air. Travelers on distant roads told of trees sprouting overnight, each with human eyes embedded in their trunks, watching silently as they passed. Ohio was no longer Ohio. It had become a body, a single, living organism fed by devotion, built upon sacrifice, pulsing with an intelligence that had slumbered for centuries and had now begun to stretch its limbs. And all who remained could feel the same unholy truth beating in their chests. The harvest had only just begun. The rivers were the first to change. The Muskingum, the Cuyahoga, the Ohio itself, all began to darken, their waters thickening as though mixed with tar. Fishermen who dipped their nets found them tangled with fibrous strands, pale as veins, writhing like living cords. Those who drank from the streams reported strange tastes, metallic, sweet, and addicting. Within days, their skin grew blotched with bark-like patches, and when they spoke, their voices carried faint echoes of children's laughter. Merchants traveling along the canals told of locks refusing to open, gates jammed with roots that seemed to grow overnight. Their barges became stranded, cargo spoiling as tendrils slipped into holds and wrapped around barrels, draining grain, oil, and whiskey as though feeding the earth itself. Trade routes collapsed, not from bandits, but from the forest reclaiming what men had once stolen. Roads split open, stones shoved upward by rising roots. Horses panicked, hooves sinking into soil that clutched and held them fast. Riders swore the trees bent over the roads at night, their branches forming tunnels from which no light escaped. Some who entered never returned. Others staggered out days later, claiming they'd been gone only minutes, eyes hollow, their hair threaded with leaves. And always the laughter. It drifted across the hills in the wind, not carried by mouths but embedded in the air itself. Families barred their windows at night, but still they heard it, high distant, relentless. Children woke in their beds, giggling in their sleep, speaking in voices that were not their own. By morning, many were gone. No doors were broken. No tracks were found. Only the faint impression of roots in the floorboards where their beds had been. Neighboring towns tried to resist. They formed militias, posted guards, prayed louder than the bells could ring. But their weapons rusted overnight, powder turned damp, and their churches themselves grew distorted. Crosses sprouting thorns, pews fusing into the floor as if reclaimed by soil. Congregations found themselves trapped within sanctuaries that had become forests of their own. What spread from Ohio was not invasion in the way men understood it. It was infiltration, an infection through water, wood, and word. No army marched, no banners waved. Instead, the land itself became the conqueror, turning every stream, every field, every breath into an altar for the root. And still, no one outside spoke of it, because those who left Ohio never truly left. By autumn of 1837, whispers had reached Washington. Letters from Ohio officials described natural disturbances, unexplained vanishings, and geological upheavals that destroyed towns overnight. But the phrasing was deliberately softened, as if those writing feared to name what they'd seen. Behind the words, though, were reports of entire counties gone silent. No correspondence, no commerce, no survivors willing to speak. The government sent surveyors first. Men tasked with mapping land for future railroads entered Ohio with their instruments, journals, and rifles. Weeks passed. Only one returned. He arrived in Pittsburgh barefoot, clothes shredded, eyes blistered as though he had stared into the sun too long. When asked what he had seen, he would only say, "The ground breathes." Then he clawed at his own throat until he died. Next came the military. A regiment of 300 men was dispatched under the guise of quelling civil unrest. They carried cannons, bayonets, and orders to re-establish control. But weeks later, their supply wagons stumbled back with no soldiers, only drivers, silent, pale, their hands covered in sap. Inside the wagons lay crates not of ammunition, but of bells. Hundreds of them, each bell small, delicate, humming faintly though no hand touched them. The bells were sent to Washington for study. Within days, clerks in the War Office began hearing them ring, though no sound was recorded on instruments. Some clerks walked into the Potomac at night, never resurfacing. Others were found standing motionless in hallways, mouths whispering children's names that did not exist. The official decision was swift: silence. Ohio was declared economically unviable, its counties marked as unsuitable for settlement. Maps were redrawn, routes diverted. Public discussion ceased. The story of Ohio was buried not with lies, but with absence. No mention in newspapers. No warnings to settlers. The region was left to rot in memory. But silence is not safety, because while officials buried the truth, the bells multiplied. Survivors carried them unknowingly, embedded in clothing, lodged in wagon wheels, sewn into children's toys. The sound spread into new states like a contagion no law could contain. Washington's choice was not protection. It was complicity. They allowed the root to live, so long as its hunger was quiet, so long as it did not threaten the capital directly. But secrets rot, and rot always spreads. The silence around Ohio worked for a time. Maps forgot it. Historians ignored it. Families who lost children were told never to speak of them again. But the bells did not remain buried. They began to surface like seeds carried by the wind, appearing in places no one could explain. In New York, a dock worker unloading cargo from a transatlantic ship found a small bronze bell tangled in a coil of rope. He thought little of it, until that night when he awoke to find his son standing by the window, staring toward the harbor, whispering the names of children he had never met. Days later, the boy was gone. In Boston, a wealthy family preparing for a dinner party discovered a velvet-lined box on their doorstep. Inside were 12 bells, each etched with names no one recognized. Servants swore the bells rang faintly whenever they passed the nursery. By the week's end, the family's 3 children had vanished, leaving their beds perfectly made, their shoes neatly placed by the door. Even across the ocean, echoes spread. In Liverpool, children disappeared from boarding houses near the docks. Their guardians spoke of dreams filled with forests, though they had never left the city. A sailor swore he saw pale roots slithering across the deck of his ship, dragging a child-sized shape into the water. He leapt after it, but nothing surfaced. The bells carried themselves in trade routes, in luggage, in crates of grain and barrels of whiskey. They traveled like spores, finding soil wherever children slept. And always, they carried the same hunger, the same laughter, the same whispering voices that drew the young away from the arms meant to hold them safe. Reports trickled back to Washington, but by then it was too late. The officials had chosen silence, and silence cannot be recalled once spoken. To admit the truth now would mean admitting the lie, and so they buried each new case under explanations of disease, of fire, a simple misadventure. But those who heard the bells knew better. This was no longer an Ohio problem. It was no longer even an American problem. The bells had taken root in the arteries of the world, and every ring was a pulse in something larger, older, and unstoppable. The question was no longer what happened in Ohio. It was, what has Ohio unleashed upon us all? For years, the bells were seen only as cursed objects, strange artifacts tied to disappearances. But those who studied them long enough, those who dared to trace the patterns, uncovered something far more sinister. The bells were not isolated instruments. They were nodes. Each bell was carved differently, etched with symbols that at first seemed random. But when the designs were copied, cataloged, and compared across regions, from Ohio to New York, from Liverpool to Marseille, a horrifying truth emerged. They were fragments of a single design, like shards of stained glass. Each bell was a piece of a greater mosaic. The mosaic was a map, not of the land, not of the seas, but of veins, an invisible network stretching across the earth. Places where the soil was thinner, where roots pulsed just beneath the surface, where children vanished most often. Each bell marked a junction in that unseen body, a skeletal framework being assembled not above ground, but through us. Those who dared to test it reported impossible phenomena. When enough bells were placed together in sequence, they rang without being touched. The air grew heavy, as if space itself bent under pressure, and sometimes, faintly, a sound beneath the ringing could be heard. Not music, not words, breathing. The children were not being taken at random. They were being distributed, placed like offerings at points of convergence. Each disappearance was not an accident, but a deliberate arrangement in the construction of something that dwarfed human architecture. A cathedral not of stone, but of flesh, roots, and stolen voices, growing, pulsing, feeding. In hushed whispers, investigators began calling it the choir, because when bells rang together across distances, the voices of the missing could sometimes be heard faintly, chanting in unison. The sound was not sorrowful, not pleading. It was celebratory, worshipful. The bells were the instruments. The children were the notes. And the song was not for us. It was for something beneath, something older than the nation, older than language itself. Each disappearance was another verse, each bell another chord, and together they were writing a hymn that, once finished, would not merely call it. It would wake it. The first tremors of awakening did not come with thunderous destruction. They came subtly, like the shiver of a spider's web when something vast touches the strand. Farmers in Ohio were the first to feel it. Their wells soured overnight, the water turning black and viscous, thick with the smell of rusted iron and wet soil. Livestock refused to drink. Crows circled barns without end, silent, their wings never flapping, as if held aloft by invisible currents. Then came the storms. Not the usual summer thunderheads, but tempests that carried voices. Rain fell in sheets, and with it came the sound of laughter. Not shrill or mocking, but the soft, playful laughter of children. Families barred their doors as the wind pressed against their homes like hands trying to force their way inside. And in the lightning, silhouettes were seen. Dozens of small figures standing in the fields, their faces indistinct, their bodies unmoved by rain. Rivers began to die. The Muskingum, the Cuyahoga, the Ohio itself. All turned stagnant, choked with reeds that had not grown there before. The reeds whispered in the wind, and those who leaned close swore they heard their names spoken back. Not just names of the living, but names of the vanished. Fishermen refused to cast nets, for the catch they drew up was not fish, but bundles of hair, tiny shoes, and toys swollen with water. Forests thickened unnaturally, swallowing paths that had stood open for generations. Trees leaned inward, their bark etched with grooves resembling bell markings. At night, the branches swayed not with wind, but with rhythm, as if an unseen choir was conducting them. And in that rhythm, a steady pulse could be felt in the ground, beating like a slow, massive heart. It was no longer whispers in basements, no longer isolated vanishings. The world itself was bending to the hymn. The bells had seeded not just children into its design, but the very fabric of nature. Every gust, every root, every river had become an instrument. People began fleeing Ohio, abandoning farms, towns, entire counties. But distance offered no salvation. Reports arrived from Pennsylvania, New York, Kentucky, storms carrying laughter, rivers bearing shoes, forests singing in the night. The choir was expanding, and its song was almost ready to be heard in full. For generations, people clung to the hope that the vanished children might still be alive somewhere, that they were hidden, stolen, imprisoned in some secret place. But as the signs multiplied, that fragile hope curdled into dread, because the truth revealed itself not in whispers, but in voices carried on the air. At first, it was faint, a lullaby sung over the Ohio Valley, though no mother's lips had shaped it. The melody wound itself through storms, through the hollowed trunks of trees, through the gurgling of poisoned rivers. And the words, if one listened long enough, were names. Dozens of them. The names of the missing children. Spoken not in desperation, but in unison, as if reciting a pledge. Those who heard it closely described the sound with trembling mouths. Their voices had changed. They were still children, yes, but layered with something vast and ancient, as though 1,000 echoes stood behind each syllable. It was not a cry for rescue. It was a declaration. The bells had not devoured them. They had reshaped them. The children had become instruments themselves, resonant vessels that could carry the hymn into every corner of the earth. No grave could hold them. No rescue could reclaim them, because they were no longer bodies of flesh and bone. They were voices now, woven into a symphony that grew stronger with every ring of bronze, with every pulse beneath the soil. In towns where the choir's song was strongest, parents swore they saw their lost children in mirrors, standing just behind their own reflections. Some claimed they answered when called, but their replies were distorted, like words spoken through deep water. Others reported hearing laughter spilling from toy chests or lullabies playing on music boxes that had wound down decades ago. The realization spread like contagion. The children had not vanished from the world. They had been woven into it. And once woven, they could never be unbound. The choir was not a prison. It was not even a ritual. It was a transformation. The children had become the hymn itself, mouthpieces of something that had slumbered beneath our feet long before Ohio was ever carved into maps. And when the hymn reached its crescendo, The world would no longer be able to tell the difference between the laughter of children and the voice of what had taken them. Now you understand why no graves were ever dug, why no trace of those 32 children was ever found. The truth was never absence. It was transformation. They were not stolen away. They were bound into the choir, absorbed into a hymn older than America, older than Christ, older than written word itself. And here is the most unbearable truth. It did not end in 1837. The vanishing slowed, yes, but they never ceased. Look closely at records across the Midwest, the Appalachians, the farmlands of Kentucky and Pennsylvania. Children gone without trace, no ransom, no trail, no sound but bells no one else could hear. Authorities blamed wolves, runaways, accidents. But the rhythm was there, the alignment with ancient nights when the veil thins and the soil hums. The choir never stopped singing. It only learned patience. The signs are returning now. Strange storms, rivers carrying toys, forests that whisper names in the night. Perhaps you've heard them where you live. Perhaps you've mistaken them for nothing. Wind against glass, the echo of laughter in an empty room. But deep down, the hymn is growing louder again. The children are not gone. They are waiting, and when the final bell tolls, their song will not be confined to the fields of Ohio. It will roll across oceans, carried by storms, carried by rivers, carried by every soul who dares to listen too closely. So I ask you now, listen, not with your ears, but with your bones. Do you hear the low hum beneath the silence of your room? That is the choir, stretching its voice across centuries, reminding you that some songs are never forgotten. They only wait for more voices to join. If you've walked with me through this descent, if you feel the weight of what has been revealed tonight, then do not let it vanish like those children did. Like this video, share it so the hymn cannot hide in silence. Subscribe if you want to keep descending further, because there are truths even darker than this, waiting to be spoken. And comment below where you're watching from, because if the choir has already reached your corner of the world, you need to know you are not alone. And remember this final truth. The missing were never missing. They were only rehearsing.